Hello and welcome to the Physician's First podcast, where you, the physician, comes first. Our goal is to help you defeat physician burnout, become the best version of yourself, and practice medicine on your own terms. We'll do this through optimizing your health, wealth, and well-being. I'm your host, Jeff LaFont. Let's get started with the show. All right, welcome back to the podcast. I have been excited about this one for a long time. I feel like I know Dr. Jimmy Turner because I've listened to him. He's been in my car with me over the radio for a long time. He is an anesthesiologist. He is practicing. He is in academics at Wake Forest. He is also known as the Physician Philosopher. That's another title he goes by. Well, not that you go by, but he is a self-proclaimed money nerd, and we'll get into that and what that means. He's pretty much done it all. He's a serial entrepreneur. He's a physician coach through the Alpha Coaching Experience. He's a podcaster, the Physician Philosopher. Also, Money Meets Medicine, I think, is the newest podcast. He runs MDFU, a little nod at or a little bit of sarcasm, I guess, there, and that's a medical degree financial university. So trying to teach all of us about our debt and how to manage that. All of our doctors who were not taught that. He is an author. He wrote a book called Determined: How Burnt Out Doctors Can Thrive in a Broken Medical System, and The Physician Philosopher's Guide to Personal Finance. I have not read that one, but I listened to the audio version of Determined twice, and I will tell you, and I emailed this to you one time, Jimmy, that actually got me out of a road rage incident because I had you in my head and I was listening to you, and it was like, think about the position that this guy is in and what is his perspective. And I'm like, you know what? He's probably having a bad day. I let him do his thing and he passed. But so you were with me and maybe kept me out of a road rage incident. I guess you're now in insurance, helping doctors get reliable disability insurance. We've all felt like we've been potential victims to insurance sharks, and you're doing your best, it sounds like, to guide doctors through a sound disability insurance policy process. You're helping medical students, residents, fellows, attendings with dealing with their monstrosity of debt and how to overcome that. Another new thing that you just did recently, I heard about, is the Doctors Podcast Network, helping physicians like me starting up a podcast and trying to get through that process. So you've done a lot. Also, you're a husband. You're a father of 3 kids, which you're very proud about, and we're going to get into some parenting stuff. So I don't know what I missed. I'm sure there's a bunch, but you you wear many hats. You're definitely passionate about life. So welcome to the podcast, Jimmy. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate you having me. And it's just funny listening to all of the various descriptors that you have there. And I think it goes to that question of, like, people are like, hey, Jimmy, who are you? And I've got lots of thoughts about identity questions and that sort of thing in terms of, like, who are you personally? So as you're listing off all these things, I always find it interesting. People are like, how do you fit all that into your day? And
right.
So yeah, lots of fun conversations ahead.
Well, the funny thing about that too is that question definitely comes out. How do you fit this in? And at the same time, I was thinking, I bet you at one point in time, multiple times during the year, Jimmy probably thought to himself, man, I'm not getting done what I wanted to get done, right? You're probably fighting the ideal of, you probably have a whole bunch of stuff that you think you haven't gotten done. But when I read off some of this stuff, and I probably didn't even get half of it, it's like, wow, he has done a lot, right?
Yeah, it's so, on the Enneagram, which, we can debate whether that's a valid tool or not, but, I think it's a type 3 wing too. So basically the achiever. And that's been a blessing in that I am hyper productive and I get a ton of stuff done, whether it's publishing randomized controlled trials or writing books or running businesses, that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And, but it also for a long time came with the curse that is the need for external approval in order to feel validated and worthy. That's where my self-worth came from for so long. Mm-hmm. And so I've transitioned to a life now where I try to keep things as simple as possible. I say yes to the things that excite me or that I would enjoy doing. And I say no to a lot of other opportunities. Have a lot of investors come up, say, hey, I would love for you to advise for my company based on your experience in venture capital and personal finance and burnout for doctors. And I say no to a lot of those opportunities that To be honest with you, it'd be pretty fun. I would enjoy doing those things, but I just don't have the time to allocate to that if I'm going to keep my life simple and focus on the things that matter most to me. I didn't always have that insight. I was burned out in medicine. I was burned out as an entrepreneur. I've done both of those things. Neither of them are fun. Wouldn't recommend them. But it to your point, there's only so many hours in the day. So figuring out what to say yes to and saying yes to those things, and or hell yes, as I would put it, and saying no to
Mhm.
everything else is kind of the mantra that my life has become.
Yeah, when you mentioned that you're an achiever and that how that kind of led you to being burnt out, maybe we could give a little background on what you went through and how it led you to actually write a book and then record it yourself. The book Determined, because I found it very helpful, very insightful, and I think the audience would like to hear from you about that.
Yeah, so I guess in order to explain that, I need to back up a little bit. And I went to college at a very small school. It's called Erskine. It's middle of nowhere in due west South Carolina, 600 total students. Met my wife there. We got married, moved up to Winston-Salem, went to med school, residency, fellowship, all at Wake, stayed on faculty there. So I went through med school. I was the class president, student body president, ended up being the co-chief resident of my residency. And similar to the success you were describing in your own journey professionally, I was promoted as quickly as is possible at the time of the promotion pathway at my institution. I could have actually probably been promoted sooner had they not had a time requirement on it. But was published in randomized control trials. Really enjoyed teaching, liked the clinical side of medicine. Was still having this business on the side, the physician philosopher you described earlier, and I had a few opportunities that I was kind of gearing up for that my career at that point had been groomed to step into, and which was some leadership positions in the residency program. And I had the door kind of slammed in my face, not once but four times, despite having an otherwise accomplished CV and the residents all wanting me to step into that role and having the approval of the GME director. There were just politics in my department that led to me not. I mean, there was no interview process. There's no application. It was just
Mm.
people were chosen. It's the drawback of being in an academic setting is there's an autocracy, as opposed to being in private practice where you need to get an overwhelming majority of your partners to agree to something.
Hmm.
Neither is better or worse. They
Hmm.
are just different animals to deal with. And so for me at the time, the people that were chosen are wonderful human beings. They're fantastic doctors. They ended up being great leaders in the residency program. But for me, the way that I internalized that, not having the skills that I have now, was that I was undervalued. I was unappreciated. I had this door that I thought I was walking through close on me four times. And so the way that I dealt with that personally was to say, fine, if I'm not going to feel valued here, I'm going to go find my value elsewhere.
Hmm.
And the reason that became important as I grappled with these ideas and 2 or 3 years later wrote a book about what I'd learned through that journey is that at the end of the day, you have to have three things in your professional career that can be kind of broken up into five subcomponents, but they are autonomy, so personal and professional. You need to be able to control your time and what you're doing and how you do it, both at work and in terms of your schedule. So you want to make it to t-ball games and recitals and
Hmm.
band concerts. That's the personal side of autonomy. Professional is how you practice, right? And then you need to have this sense of belonging that you're accomplishing a deeper purpose, which is typically patient care. But you also need to feel like a valued member of the team. So those are four of the five. The fifth one is competence, which, depending on how bad your imposter syndrome is, you may or may not be struggling with that one.
Hmm.
But you need all five of those things to really feel fulfilled, engaged. Self determination theory would tell you that that is what intrinsically motivates people. And for me, when that situation happened, my professional autonomy took a hit, my feeling valued, so the autonomy, belonging, competence, or the ABCs of self determination is what I call it in that book. Two of the five things were under threat in my mind. And I didn't have the tools at the time to deal with that. And so I said, hey, look, if I don't have these things, which I didn't have the phrases and terminologies to understand yet, I'm going to go create my value somewhere else. And so that's when I really poured into my business. And I did exactly that. I made a business that succeeded and did quite well, and people wanted to hear what I had to say. And so really enjoyed that journey. But that took me into the land of entrepreneurship because I burned out in medicine because I felt like I was missing that professional
Hmm.
autonomy. I felt like I was not feeling valued as a team member in my department. And so I went and found those things, the autonomy and that sense of belonging, that feeling valued on my own. Uh,
Hmm.
and then went through burnout for different reasons as an entrepreneur later. So it
It,
turns out that was not the solution. Just for those that are curious, you're like, I'm going to go make money and build a business outside of medicine. That's going to solve all my problems. It might, there's a really good chance if you don't figure out what your burnout was actually caused by, that it actually in fact won't.
Well, it sounds like you did what many physicians that are listening. We all are similar in this way that we get hyper focused on one thing. Like the hyper focus was getting into med school at some point in time. Like you
Sure.
had to be laser focused. I know I did. And then it was every step of the way. And we can get into that arrival fallacy you talk about a lot. But it sounds like, you did that you the pendulum swung the other direction as you mentioned, like you were like, all right, enough of this, I'm going to learn about entrepreneurship. And I don't know if you identified yourself as being a future budding entrepreneur, or if that was just seemed like out of necessity that it just came up.
Yeah. So for me, that journey was really interesting because if I'd known about entrepreneurship and business and venture capitalism and a whole host of other things I've been exposed to since then, I don't know that I would have gone into medicine.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, from like a personality perspective, and when people ask me about my identity, even to this day, I would say, hey, I'm a God-fearing husband and father, and I mean, entrepreneur is pretty dang high on the list. Like, I still practice medicine and I love it, and I'm actually going back to full-time medicine, so I'm doing the opposite of what a lot of other physicians listening may
Hmm.
be considering. And we could talk about why, but ultimately, for me, being a physician is not my identity, and so I never really struggled with like letting go. Like what does that
Hmm.
mean to not be a physician or to be a part-time physician, and like the judgment that that's sometimes labeled with.
Hmm.
Entrepreneurship, as I stepped into that, did become a pretty big part of my identity as I built those things, and ultimately realized, what, I just like learning. I love to learn, and so I'm always learning about something. It's different at every stage of my life. My interests change, as you mentioned. I did personal finance, I did burnout, I did coaching, I've worked and dabbled in online courses. And so for me, I didn't know that I was going to become an entrepreneur. And I'm actually quite glad that I didn't know that when I was in training. So I could have those horse blinders on and just focus on becoming a really good anesthesiologist,
Yeah. Right.
which had I not had those blinders at the time, I would probably have gotten pretty distracted.
Hmm.
And so yeah, no, I never saw that coming. But after it did, it made a lot of sense because I'm an abstract, complex problem solving person that likes to make things simple for people. That's why I think in terms of frameworks.
Hmm.
Um, and so never saw it coming, but really glad that it did.
You mentioned you're a lifelong learner. Basically, you love to learn. But from all of these ventures that I kind of read off, you're actually a lifelong teacher.
Mhm.
So uh, obviously, you're a sharer. You're confident enough to take what you've learned and to spin it and then teach others. And I think that's amazing because a lot of people don't have the confidence to do that. So Jimmy, that's a nod to you, man. I think that's impressive that you're willing to put yourself out there. You're the man in the arena, and you're going to get criticism, and so am I. And but you're out there, you're putting yourself out there and teaching others. And I think the profound effect that I bet you've had on your residents and fellows and med students and such, I bet it's pretty huge. So that's amazing.
I would say that's a huge part of my identity, and I really enjoy teaching, and the reason
Hmm.
why is because it is so fun watching the light bulb go off in someone's head as they are, introduced to an idea, and through that introduction, they are, then able to make changes in their life. And I realized pretty early on when I went into academics, is the reason I stayed, is that for whatever reason, there are lots of things that I can't do. Right. So I am pretty much dyslexic. I can't memorize things. I'm not good at details. I've had a reading disability my entire life. My kids have been able to read faster than me since third grade. So there are lots of things that I'm not good at. What I am good at is taking complicated things and making them simple for other people,
Hmm.
typically through frameworks or how to think through things. And because of that, teaching always came very naturally to me. And that's one of the things I tell people as an entrepreneur, like, hey, you're thinking about starting a venture. Great. Like, what are you naturally good at? Like, it's not
Hmm.
just about the money, but like, what are you good at? And one of the ways to figure that out is to ask people, hey, what do you, when you think of me and you want to learn from me, what are the things you want to learn from? A better way to probably ask the question is, what do you find really easy that other people find extremely complicated? And so for me, I've always been able to just kind of conceptualize things, whether it's parenting or personal finance or career transitions and burnout. And so I've always enjoyed the learning process, and I
Hmm.
probably equally enjoy the teaching process just as much. And so it's really all selfish, it's self-serving. Like, I just enjoy it, and so it happens to benefit other people. And so that's a great combination. You can find something you really enjoy that also benefits other people. That's usually a winning combination for success and for just professional fulfillment.
It's interesting when you mentioned the dyslexia. You're saying, "Hey, this was one of my biggest challenges in life, so I'm going to turn around and write two books." So,
Right.
it's interesting that you're leaning into essentially when you look at people who have different disabilities and whatnot, and end up doing things that defy logic to the general population. You basically leaned into what you see as your weakness or your challenge, and that's where you were able to make a big delta in kind of where you were at baseline to just superseding expectations. And um, I think that's amazing. So thanks for sharing that. You mentioned the word identity a few times, and I think when I went through a lot of my issues with burnout and just trying to figure out what is life, where am I, once I hit 40, like what is going on here in my job at home, and I think a lot of my issue was being my identity was completely wrapped up in being a physician. And we see that across the board. And now, since I've tried to give myself other identities, it's something interesting about like, okay, now I'm a podcaster. It doesn't take much to be a podcaster, but like once I put myself out there, it's a different little thing. Like this is fun for me. Like meeting people like you is amazing. And so now I have that identity. And then, now I'm calling myself an entrepreneur. I'm starting to open different businesses, just allowing myself to have other identities. And of course, I'm a father and a husband, and that those things are extremely important to me. Um, and so having these other hats and respecting that has allowed me to turn back to medicine and feel more gratitude for that.
Yeah. I also think people don't realize that having interests outside of medicine also makes you a better physician.
Yeah.
So when I started learning about personal finance, one of the routes that it led me down was psychology in terms
Hmm.
of how people think about money, and that turned into how do people think about life and career decisions. I was a philosophy major, hence the physician philosopher. It's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
just an alliteration thing.
Yeah.
And so I've always enjoyed learning about how people think. And when you take those concepts, some of which I learned from behavioral finance and literally just the psychology of money, and then taught people about, hey, when you consent somebody for a procedure, like there's this idea in medicine, for example, that, hey, we want to avoid patriarchal medicine and telling people what to do is this terrible
Hmm.
thing that's meant to be avoided. And we should just give people objective information and let them make informed decisions. That is honestly the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Once you understand how people actually think, it's like sounds great in a vacuum, just like communism does. But it turns out that, when you actually have conversations with people, the words that you use, the tone in which you use them, there is a 0% chance fundamentally that when you talk to somebody, you're not going to influence the direction that they think.
Hmm.
And so if you know that, trying to avoid something that's impossible becomes, just something that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I tell people all the time, like my residents, I'm like, hey, look, your job as a consultant is to figure out what's best for this patient. And then you're going to guide that conversation. Like, are you still going to talk about risks and benefits and all of the whole nine yards? 100%. But you're also going to guide that conversation based on your expertise and your experience
Hmm.
in terms of which direction that should probably go. And to try to avoid that is just means that you don't understand how people think. That realization made me a better doctor, but it came from understanding how people think about money. And
Really? All right.
yeah, and so there are studies on that we don't have to dive into, but suffice it to say that dabbling outside of medicine, people are like, oh, you don't focus all of your stuff on, all of your time on medicine, and therefore you're not a good doctor. You're not keeping up with the literature. And it's like, I would argue actually that some of the best insights I have as a physician and how to talk to people came from me not practicing medicine. It came from all these other stuff.
I totally agree. I think that's a great point. You're able to relate to your patients more. Like you said, I think we do tiptoe around making recommendations sometimes and trying to avoid the old school picture of a physician, that patriarchal approach of saying like, you will do this. Like we've all been taught to don't do that, but then it confuses everybody.
Yep.
And how many times did they just try, the patient will actually signal this to you when they say, hold on. If I was your mom, what would you do? That's what they're trying to get to, right?
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
that's
It's
it.
save the personal finance. Like, hey, we
Yeah.
can't talk about like individual securities and stuff. And I'm like, no, like I can't. Well, actually, I can do that because I'm not a licensed financial advisor and I don't have to deal with FINRA on the SEC. But all that to say, like, if you're a financial planner, like you can't do that. What you can do is say, hey, this is what I do with my money,
Hmm.
right? Because you're not giving advice in that situation, but you are saying like, hey, this is what I would do if this was my mother. This is how I would handle it. If I were in your shoes, this is what I would do.
Hmm.
And so you can like sleep at night saying, hey, that's how I avoid patriarchal medicine. But is it really? I
Hmm.
mean, I don't know. I've got lots of thoughts on that, but diatribe.
Well, there's been some. I'm picturing like this life cycle of Jimmy Turner's career, and because we talked through, you did very well in residency, et cetera, and then you started to not like your career so much, so you learned about business and finance and built a side business, and then you alluded to the fact that you, as an entrepreneur, there were things that burnt you out in that sector, and now you're kind of bouncing back full-time medicine. But with that, it makes me think about the term resilience, right? So,
Sure.
was it your experience being coached, or was it your experience coaching others that has allowed you to adapt in a functional way and recognize the signs in yourself that it's time to change a little bit? Like maybe your mission this year is a little different than it was last year. Like what's your thought on that?
So two things. One is, and I shared this before the show. I'm a very transparent, open book, and so I don't want people listening to make this sound like I'm just this raging success story. So after I went through that burnout in my medical career for a couple of years, like I was in a complete tailspin. I was trying to figure out how to make it work. I ended up on antidepressants. I was passively suicidal at one point.
Hmm.
And so like this was not like hey, Jimmy just like went on to the next thing and like found
Hmm.
great success.
Sure.
Like that not is not at all how things worked for me. Ended up getting diagnosed with Graves' disease, having panic attacks, how I figured that out. Like,
Hmm.
so there have been lots of ups and downs and setbacks on this journey. But for me, I think resilience is an important concept.
Hmm.
And I actually like the concept of anti-fragility even more.
Hmm.
And I'm trying to remember what book I was reading when I discovered this idea. Maybe it'll come to me. But they gave an example of like they tried to build this biosphere out on the West Coast. And I want actually I want to say it was Arizona. And as part of that, they like tried to
Is,
build this bubble
that's
where
Pauly Shore's movie, Biodome.
yeah, well,
You ever see that ridiculous movie?
I've seen parts of it, and maybe it comes from the actual
Maybe
experiment.
so. I don't know.
Yeah, but they like built this thing. They're like, hey, we're just gonna build this so that like someday, if we colonize Mars or whatever, like let's see if we can build this biosphere where the only things that are in there are things that we place, and then let's see if we can build a self-sustaining environment. And one of the biggest reasons it didn't end up working out is because they planted trees in this thing, and then sometime thereafter it would start, growing and growing and growing, and the oxygen would be there, but then the trees at some point would fall over. And what they learned is that actually all of those winds and the turbulence that a tree experiences, as it experiences that and kind of tries to knock the tree over when it's little, it grows deeper roots. And so those roots ultimately are what stabilize it. And so the tree becomes what's called anti-fragile, like actually dealing with the stress of wind, trying to knock it over is what in the long term, once it gets big enough, it now has the roots that are deep enough to support the tree, as opposed to living in a biosphere where there's no stress, there's no wind,
Hmm.
and they get big enough and then they fall over because it can't support its own weight. Right. And
Hmm.
so for me, that's kind of more of my journey is having these things happen in my life that led to a lot of stress, that led to a lot of setbacks, and then having the insight now, 10 years down the road, to look back and see that, oh, those moments where I felt terrible and I didn't know what to do and I was in a giant tailspin and I had the existential crisis questions that you alluded to earlier
Hmm.
about what is this life? What the heck am I doing with it?
Hmm.
Ultimately ended up making me a better version of myself later. And I can see the pitfalls that I fell into, the stories that I told myself and the narratives that I had and the paradigms that I used after I
Hmm.
felt undervalued by my job. Like, were those things even true? Right. Or was I just punching myself in the face and asking for people to feel bad for me for 2 years? It's probably the latter, to be honest with
Yeah,
you. But
maybe
I
so.
didn't have that insight at the time. And so for me, it's, resilience might be a good word, but I think anti-fragile and learning how to become that way. It's the same reason why as a parent, when you handle everything for your kid and you're like, oh, I'm being a good dad, I'm being a good
Hmm.
parent. Actually, you're not. Long
Hmm.
term, you are not doing the kind thing for your kid because you're not helping them learn how to deal with stress and have conversations themselves and fight their own battles. You think you're being nice and helping protect your child. And it turns out that when they get big, they're going to be like that tree and fall over.
Hmm.
And so anti-fragility is more how I would describe my career. It was not up and to the right. Lots of setbacks, lots of struggles. But ultimately, in the end, those struggles made me better.
Yeah, I'm sorry I painted to the audience that you're actually a superstar. Actually, and I
You don't need
appreciate
to
you.
apologize. I just want.
No, but what I'm gonna say, Jimmy, is to keep your head from swelling after me presenting you that way. I'm gonna present a blooper reel of your life after this,
Oh, great. I'm okay. I'm
keep you
perfectly
great.
okay with that.
But you made me think about um Ryan Holiday's "The Obstacle Is the Way" and the
Hmm.
Stoicism, and there's the principle, I believe it's kind of this idea of adversarial growth is more or less what you're alluding to. And I think that's a psychology term where, you know, the biggest growth that you have in your life or as a person is through the obstacles, the things that challenge you the most, as we talked about with your maybe your dyslexia, and you powered through that, and then you know, I guess it's proportionate to the challenge that you have, the growth that you receive from getting through that. So yeah, there's just so many different ways to say this. I guess I was never a philosophy major, but I could see you having these conversations for a long time. I mean, it's one thing after another. It makes a lot of sense though. How
Yeah.
many books say the same thing in different words, now that I think about
Well,
it.
I was having this conversation with my chair the other day. So we got a new chair at Wake, who I'm actually a big fan of. Loves reading leadership books, and
Hmm.
so we talk and have a lot of these conversations. And
Hmm.
so came from Duke, and I was honestly like I was a pretty vocal critic of him coming in, and I would tell him that, and ended up really enjoying him being at Wake and the conversations I've had. And we were talking the other day as I've gotten to know him, it's been great. But we were talking about how we both have a real enjoyment from reading Simon Sinek's work,
Hmm.
and he has this book that's called Infinite Game,
Hmm.
and in the Infinite Game he talks about how it turns out that he had this competition with Adam Grant, who's another great author in that space. And as we're talking about this, to your point, you're like, hey, well, there's lots of books that have been written, and they kind of combine these different ideas. Like that's how I view Simon Sinek. Simon Sinek takes all of these complicated, like I view myself a little bit as a Simon Sinek, where you take all these different concepts and you put them into a book or a framework or a
Hmm.
podcast or what have you, so
Hmm.
that other people can not have to go read those 20 different things. They can take
Hmm.
them and distill them down into an understandable framework. Like I didn't create self-determination theory,
Hmm.
right? I didn't create burnout, but I was probably the first person to combine those two things on opposite sides of the spectrum so that you understand that they're actually opposites of each other. And that when you address one, you will then have the answer to the other. And so that's very different than Adam Grant, for example, who does the research, does all the learning, and then delivers that to somebody else. So Adam Grant's much more of like, instead of like a quilt maker, like, Cynic is, and like I am on the very, very specific topics that I talk about. Adam Grant like makes the individual squares and then builds this quilt himself.
Hmm.
And so it is, I think there are very few Adam Grants
Hmm.
and a lot more of the rest of us that take these ideas and try to distill them down to where people can like understand them without having to read the 47 books.
Hmm.
So you can read 100 books on investing, or you could just trust me that index funds make sense. It turns out.
Way to
So
distill that down, Jimmy. Makes
yeah.
it so
So
much simpler.
yeah, there you
Uh,
go.
well, we talked a lot about identity. We mentioned a little bit about parenting. Curiosity. I found that probably because I have three younger kids, and most of the time when I have a guest on here, always I tend to ask them this question: how do we not f up our kids? As we
Mm,
don't want messed up doctors' kids. We've all seen it. We've all seen kids who were raised well off, and it just things went off the rails, and probably because of what you alluded to with parents making it easy on their kids and whatnot. But how do you make sure that for your three children, that they understand the power of entrepreneurship, value of money, just values in general? How do you approach that? Do you have any resources, and like what are your thoughts through parenting?
yeah. So I think the overriding principle of our parenting style is just being intentional. And
Hmm.
so there are very few things that happen in our house that don't happen for a reason. And so, for example, technology, right? My
Hmm.
my eighth grader has a cell phone. It is an Apple smartphone that can text, it can call, and it has Spotify. That is the extent of her cell phone exposure.
Hmm.
And all of her friends have social media. All of them have Instagram and TikTok. They all have YouTube, which we're probably about to cross the YouTube bridge just
Hmm.
because it's the second largest search engine. Actually, I don't know if I can even say that anymore with ChatGPT and other AI solutions
Hmm.
that are out there. But historically, it's the second largest search engine. And but that said, like I've done the research, I've read the books on exposure to social media, and in particular in young girls, and how
Hmm.
harmful it is to them. Right. And so that came from being intentional about not just handing my kid a phone, but saying like, hey, what are the repercussions of me handing my kid a phone that then they're glued to the entire time? And let's be real, like 90% of the people listening are addicted to their phone.
Hmm.
And, if you have a kid, at some point they've said, hey, daddy, hey, mommy, can you put your phone down? I would like to talk to you. Or, hey, daddy, hey, mommy, why are you always on that? I feel like you don't pay attention to me.
Hmm.
At some point, that conversation is going to happen if it hasn't happened already. And then we hand this addictive device to our kid and say, hey, go have fun. And then we wonder why they can't have tough conversations or deal with boredom or, sit and actually think about life. Right. Like, they are the classic person that we've all become where we step into a meeting and instead of saying, hey, Jeff, how's your family? I heard your dad's sick and things are going on. Are you guys doing all right over there? Where instead we're like, we got this, screen in front of us that we're like scrolling through,
Hmm.
death scrolling through Facebook or Instagram. And we don't know how to have those tough conversations. And so, being intentional, I think, is the key. And when you start thinking about everything through a lens of intentionality, then other things kind of take focus. Hey, your kid's having a trouble at school with the teacher. Okay, great. What's the answer there? Right. So if you go and talk to the teacher yourself, what are you teaching your kid? What's your kid learning from that? Right. Well, in my opinion, you're teaching them that when they have trouble, they go talk to someone else and they handle it for them.
Hmm.
And that you think that they're not equipped to do so themselves. And that you don't believe in the idea of anti-fragility and that having those tough conversations will actually make them a better human being, whether that
Hmm.
be negotiation in entrepreneurship later in life or learning how to have tough conversations with colleagues at work or becoming a leader in their workplace who now has an ability to have tough conversations with other people that aren't meeting expectations.
Hmm.
Right. Uh, it's almost like the difference between niceness and kindness, right? Like the nice thing to do is for your kid to never feel bad. The kind thing to do is to realize that them feeling bad, as you alluded to earlier, the Ryan Holiday, the obstacle is the
Hmm.
way, is actually the kind thing in the end for them to be put through because it builds resilience, because it builds a skill set to have tough conversations. And so for me, like my family, we are very intentional about parenting decisions that we make.
Hmm.
And so that is the lens through which every decision that we make goes through. And we try to do that as often and as much as we can. Right. So another example, it is a big no-no in my opinion to say like, hey, you're going to set a boundary for a kid and then you don't follow through.
Yep, we all
Right.
do it.
Like you're like, if you keep that up, we're going to leave the supermarket right now. Like, no, you're not. You need to get the groceries. You're not actually going to leave the supermarket. And so what you just taught your kid is if you keep acting this way, I'm going to set this pretend boundary that I'm never going to hold you to.
Hmm.
Right. And so like long term, you're like, oh, my kid's bouncing off the rails. I can't control them. Like, I don't understand. Well, it's because since birth, you've taught them that boundaries aren't real and that there aren't true consequences to their actions. And so then later in life, they have a job and they don't understand that when they show up late every day, that they actually do get fired. Like that's a
Hmm.
thing. Like there are going to be points in their life where there are expectations. And if you don't meet them and they aren't used to the concept of boundaries, that it turns out they won't succeed. Hard work, same thing. Right. And so all of these conversations come from an intentional focus. All three of my kids are very different. They're all very, very different. So you can't parent them the same. My oldest is a phenomenally hard worker. She plays her flute once or twice or 1 to 2 hours every single day. I've never had to ask her. She just loves doing it. She wants to be really good at playing the flute.
Sounds just like our Maddie. She plays clarinet. Same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Same person.
Hard worker. She's
Yep.
the best flute player in her county for middle school. And so that's just her personality. My son is an unbelievably gifted student. He's always going to be off the charts on his scores, but hard work's not really his thing because things come naturally to him, right? And so with my oldest, with Grace, we will have to focus on concepts of self-worth and how her ability and her penchant for hard work is actually going to make her insanely successful in life. And that even though math's a little hard right now, that hard work's going to make her a better human. And so lots of conversations about that with Grace. Whereas with Wesley, it's conversations about at some point in life, things will become difficult for you enough that that skill set of hard work is going to be required and you're not going to have it. So why don't we develop that now? Right. So
Dude,
all intentional.
I swear you cloned my family. Like the Turner family, LaFont family is like that is the same layout. It replaced the name, with Grace with Maddie and what's your son's name?
Wesley.
Wesley, yeah, Wesley with Lucas. We got the same situation.
Yep.
Now let's see if you hit with the third one, if that's about the same.
Yeah. So my youngest is our free spirit.
Hmm.
But we're having a conversation with her. She's 8. I was having a conversation with her yesterday. She was in tears because a friend was pointing out to her that she was a grade ahead of her in terms of her reading ability, and that Anna was just a second grader, like she couldn't read at a third grade level. And Anna, the conversation devolved into Anna being like, she's doing multiplication, and I still have trouble with just like addition, like I can't even
Hmm.
add, and conversations around what her strengths and weaknesses are, right?
Hmm.
and having a conversation about, hey, like Anna, what do you think about the fact that your dad is was a 35-year-old doctor and that your sister could read faster than him in third grade? I mean, she'd chew through 1,000-page books in a week, and I can't do that. It's just not my skill set, right? There are things that I struggle with, but hey, because of my struggles, I've also recognized I've got all these other strengths. And like, look at how good of an artist you are, how creative you are. She is our little philosopher. She asks very abstract questions that I love engaging and having conversations with. I think very similarly to her. I'm the youngest child in my family too. And so just having conversations with Anna, right? They're not about hard work. They're not about, that sort of thing that I have conversations with Wesley about. They're about, hey, let's look at our weaknesses and strengths and appreciate who we are and be grateful for those things. It's a lot of gratitude conversations with my youngest,
Hmm.
and maybe that'll change as she moves through her stages of life. She's obviously younger,
Hmm.
but she is our very strong-willed, free spirit. If we'd had Anna first, we might have just had one kid, kind of kid.
Hmm.
And so that's her personality, and she's awesome. She could have her own Instagram account because just the things that come out of her mouth are hilarious.
Yep, Jules is like that. She's our third one. So, how do you teach them all about money? It sounds like obviously you're trying to teach them about social media, guide them, allow them to see and do hard things, and um, deal with criticism, etc. But how do you teach them about money?
Yeah, so I think money is a more concrete concept when they're younger, right? And so for Wesley and Anna, that turns into a hey, Daddy, I'm in the checkout line. Can I have this thing? And me
Mm-hmm.
saying, do you have the money to pay for it? Right? Sounds
Mm-hmm.
like an awkward question. Like, what do you mean? Like they're 8, they're 11.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they get money for their birthdays. They get money for other things that they do. And so it's a very simple conversation. It's like, oh, you don't have the money? No, you can't get that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Again, it goes back to this nice versus kind conversation and being intentional. Like, what does that teach my kid? That teaches my kid that if they don't have the money, they can't afford something,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're learning that, hey, this little plastic thing that daddy pays for, actually is metal. The credit cards we have are metal, but it just doesn't pay for thing. Like there's actually money behind that, although it's fiat currency, different conversation. But that's a much more complicated concept that maybe that'll be like a high school conversation. Um, and so it's very tactical. Hey, here are dollar bills in your hands. This is what these dollar bills accomplish. Let's talk about spending money. Can you afford things? Let's talk about saving money if there's something you want to save up for and buy. Let's talk about hard work and how you earn money through various things, right? So, I might pay my kid for a project that they help me with, as a way for them to learn that, oh, when I put in work, I get paid. At some point in life, I'll separate those ideas and help them learn that the number of hours you put in isn't, doesn't correlate to the amount of money you make. But that's a conversation I'm not having with my 8-year old, right?
Mm-hmm.
My you know eighth grader, we are saving up money for a car, and so one of the ways that we do that is I say, look, if you put money in, there will be something called the daddy match, the mommy match, where we will put money in for you as well to match the money that you've contributed. Given the price of cars, it's going to be at a ratio. She'll probably put in $1. We'll put in two
How
or
corporate
three.
of you? You have a matching structure and everything. I love
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and so she can learn about the match, and
Yeah,
we're investing that
exactly.
money so she can
Yep.
understand compounding interest, and
Sure.
while she saves up for something for a car. She's old enough now to understand that. We can pull up the account and see what she's saved, to get to that goal, and have conversations about investing and saving and time in the market and that sort of thing. One of my best friends, actually, Mike, who helps with Money Meets Medicine disability insurance,
Mm-hmm.
he is my partner there, and we have a text chain. It's called the family because we're so close.
Mm-hmm.
And Mike started up a brokerage account for the kids where they get to pick stocks and watch them grow over time. And we've encouraged them about diversification and having those conversations, and they can watch it. And it's kind of a competition between the 5 kids, like who's doing the best.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, lots of intentional focus on how old are you? What can you understand right now? What is the lessons that I want you to learn at this current time based on your understanding and your age? And as they grow, naturally the concepts become more complicated and are built upon the ones that they learned when they were little.
Solid, man. I was trying to address some of these things with my kids, and I bought the cash flow quadrant for kids game from Robert Kiyosaki. My son mastered it in about 7 minutes. It was a waste of money. So I'm always looking at resources for my kids to try and teach them about time value of money, entrepreneurship, liabilities, assets, that kind of stuff. So if you come across anything, definitely let me know. But
Sure.
You talked a lot. I know we're a little short on time. Certainly, you're passionate about helping physicians with disability obtain a good disability policy and also educating them about finances. So, what's a good starting place for physicians at any stage in their career, whether should they be reaching out to you as med students? I don't know, but when's a good point in time for them to reach out to you to learn more about finances? Why should they do that? And kind of what resources do you offer them?
Yeah, so it depends on what stage of training they're in. If they're a medical student, I'd point them to my book, which is you can download for free on moneymeetsmedicine.com. That book is chronological in order, so it's actually helpful if you're in med school because it starts there, talks about residency, talks about
Hmm.
becoming an attending physician, from investing in student loans, which hilariously maybe need to be a chapter that has to be rewritten for a third time, just because student loans are stupid at the moment that we're recording this,
Hmm.
and crazy, and no one knows what's going to happen.
Hmm.
But the book is the best resource, and it's completely free for med students
Awesome.
and also for residents. As you get into residency and in med school, obviously you can listen to the Money Meets Medicine podcast. You're listening to a podcast right now, so likely you're a podcast consumer. That might be
Hmm.
the best place to point you to. But yeah, as you get to the disability insurance side, you can listen to the podcast or read the book and kind of learn my story. But the short version of it is that an insurance agent didn't do the right thing for me when I was a med student and got the training and found out there was a product that I could have gotten that he didn't tell me about. And the
Hmm.
reason why is because he's trying to earn a commission off me. And
Hmm.
so the entire reason that Money Meets Medicine disability insurance even exists is that as I got into the space and over the last 8 years, it was just kind of validated over and over and over again that there's next to no one you can trust in this space. And
Hmm.
so it turned into the old axiom that if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself.
Hmm.
And so the only way that I could protect physicians and make sure that they didn't get denied disability insurance and not be able to get it like I did, I can't get disability insurance to this day because of an insurance agent screwing me.
Hmm.
So the only way I could prevent that from happening to other doctors was to start Money Meets Medicine disability insurance with Mike. And so we've really loved helping people. We've saved them from countless numbers of really bad situations where they were going to get denied or they weren't told about the guaranteed standard issue policy, which I won't dive into now because it's too complicated probably at this point to discuss. But suffice it to say, we've literally had one person denied disability insurance of the hundreds of doctors we've helped, and that was a very specific particular situation where they didn't disclose something
Hmm.
and it ended up kind of biting them. So be honest about your medical problems when you talk to your insurance agent. It's fundamentally important, and it'll help prevent some of that. But ultimately, if they want to do that, they can find that moneymeetsmedicine.com as well.
I remember there was a hot debate when I was in residency and fellowship at what point you should get a disability
I love this
policy
question.
locked in. I bet you hear it all the time. So what are your comments on that?
Yeah, so
When should you do this?
the best time to get disability insurance is the day before you get disabled. Since you don't know what that's going to be, and I don't have a crystal ball. If I did,
Yep.
I'd be in Vegas. Um, it turns out that the younger you are, the less expensive it is. The
Hmm.
younger you are, you're locking in your current medical history, which is likely the healthiest it's going to be.
Hmm.
So if you do get a certain kind of fully underwritten policy where they look at your medical history, and they take you through all that and they look at everything, you're going to be able to customize that, potentially have a higher amount that you can get each month. And if you're healthy, great, do that now, lock in your health history so that when you get diagnosed with anxiety and Graves' disease, like I did and didn't expect to in my early 30s,
Hmm.
it's not a big deal because you did it back when you were healthy. And the other thing too is there are certain programs that's particularly for residents called the guaranteed standard issue policy. This is the kind that you should get if you have type 1 diabetes, anxiety, depression, orthopedic injuries, things that would prevent you from getting fully underwritten policies without exclusions or denials.
Hmm.
It only exists when you're in training.
Oh.
And so if you don't get it when you're in training, like, I'm going to wait till I get an attending paycheck. And you're like, great, Jimmy, I get this email all the time. Hey, I've got type 1 diabetes and I'm 12 months after training. And, I understand I need disability insurance. I understand why it's so important now. So, who should I talk to? And I'm like, well, you shouldn't talk to anybody because you're no longer insurable. You have type 1 diabetes. An insurance company's not going to touch you with a 10-foot pole.
Mm.
But if you were back in training, you would have had the guaranteed standard issue policy, which is guaranteed so long as you haven't been disabled and you haven't been denied. That one you
Mm.
could have gotten, but you waited until after training. And so there are lots of reasons that behoove you. The GSI is not guaranteed to stay each year if you have it offered at your institution. To get it as early as you can. That said, if none of those things happen, your health doesn't change, the GSI is still offered when you're, in your chief year, your last year residency, you would have saved money and you don't get disabled. You would have saved money on all those monthly payments to lock in your disability insurance. And I would say, hey, look, you rolled the dice, you took the risk, knowing all the risks that are out there. Financially, you ended up being ahead because you didn't make those payments each month to have disability insurance. But if you get disabled, you become unhealthy, the GSI no longer exists at your institution because they got rid of it, or any of the other things that I just mentioned. Well, man, you really should have, probably at that point would look back and be like, I really wish I'd gotten this earlier in training. So I can't tell you what's right or wrong. I don't have a crystal ball. I can tell you that if you wait, you're taking risks
Hmm.
that you don't necessarily have to take. There are ways to make disability insurance affordable, despite what some insurance agents would put in front of you and tell you, hey, this is the cost. The higher you pay, the more commission they make. They often won't tell you about other options because of that. And so that said, the earlier you can get it, there are lots of arguments for why that's better.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And physicians are risk averse. They do not trust insurance agents. They do not trust
And they
financial
shouldn't,
advisors.
to be clear,
Yeah.
they shouldn't.
So what do? They ask people like their colleagues, well, who did you use? And it's funny because that perpetuates physicians using the same person because someone else did, but nobody actually ever vetted that person probably, right?
Well,
So,
and the scarier part is that there are physician finance websites that I'm not going to, name publicly that are extremely well known and have lists. And
mhm.
those lists exist and are ordered in which they get paid. So the
Mm,
highest paying person's on the top. It's not the best person, not the best
right,
person for doctors.
right.
It's the one that's paying for the highest sponsorship fee. Or they'll
Yeah.
hide them behind a white labeled closed door and you have no idea who you're working with. And there's a really good chance that person's not great.
Yep.
So even when you go to like physician financial sites and you try to find that, like, good luck. You don't know what you're getting.
Well, I think what cuts through the mud here is that you are a physician who actively had the problem. You're passionate about it. You developed a product looking out for physicians and trainees. And so I think that should be the gold standard is a physician like you offer, leading other physicians to these products. And so I think I would encourage all of you guys to check out, Jimmy's Money Meets Medicine. I think it's a really huge resource for you. And it's not just disability insurance, a lot of financial education. A lot of you might get mixed up with IRAs, Roth IRAs, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is very confusing for people who weren't taught it. It's really not that hard. And Jimmy can distill it down really, really, really well. I will say that is one of your superpowers that I've observed. So I do agree with you on that. Um, as we're parting ways here, it's time for you to go here. But for physicians who may be feeling overwhelmed, w what are some resources that you would recommend? Do you usually point people to coaching? Are there certain books, or what's a good starting point for those people?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote determined so people could kind of start to wrap their heads around exactly diagnosing what the problem is through
Yeah.
that framework I mentioned earlier. I think that if you understand that, it'll better able you to kind of know what resources to tap into. Right?
Hmm.
Is your main problem personal autonomy over your schedule? Well, now we're having a financial independence conversation. We're talking about other opportunities to build income outside of medicine that taps into the other stuff that you and I were talking about before the
Yeah.
show.
Yep.
Is it a feeling valued conversation? Is it imposter syndrome? Well, now we're talking about people having conversations with you, typically coaches, to kind of help you like see like this is the narrative, this is the perspective, the paradigm that you're using right now that's leading to a lot of those things you're feeling. Career transitions. I would argue that having that conversation with someone else is also helpful. So it depends on what you're working on, exactly what you need. Of course, there are great books out there. Ryan Holiday, a lot of coaching comes from stoicism. And
Hmm.
so his books, if you like reading that kind of thing, you got it. You have to be a certain kind of person to enjoy reading stoicism. But it is where a lot of coaching comes from. And so I think that those are good ways to start to understand what's going on.
Hmm.
I think the arrival fallacy is a big one. I talk about that in Determined too.
Big time. Yeah.
So that is a story that I've yet to meet a doctor that doesn't relate to.
Hmm.
So that's all stuff that's discussed inside of that book. And we've kind of whittled down on coaching in terms of what I've done. So that's one of the things that still exists in the background to some extent, but it's definitely not a focus of mine. So I'm not saying like, hey, join my coaching program, because
Hmm.
honestly, it's not really a focus of mine at the moment. And
Sure.
so, but I do think coaching for a lot of people is really helpful, shifting that perspective that you have, because I can't tell you how many doctors change jobs because they're overwhelmed, disappointed, otherwise unhappy in medicine without making the diagnosis of what's actually wrong. they change jobs and they end up being just as disgruntled
Yeah,
in their new
exactly.
job. And they're like, what?
Yeah.
This is supposed to fix my problem. It turns out it doesn't. So, and the
Yeah.
reason why, just like in medicine, you make the diagnosis before you try to apply the treatment, right?
Yeah, totally agree. Well, thanks for sharing all your personal stories and, and spending time with us here today. A lot of physicians have gone through what you've gone through and they just haven't told people. You mentioned passive suicidal ideation. I think that's very common. I think I've experienced that as well. And I think we need to normalize this for our physician colleagues, and let them know that they don't need to be isolated. There's lots of different options. Identity is a huge thing, like we mentioned. So anything you can do to explore your interests outside of medicine will rebuild you from the inside out. So, thanks again, Jimmy. There's so much we could talk about for hours. I mean, we talked about parenting, we talked about finances, we talked about disability insurance, burnout, et cetera. Very inspiring journey that you're on. And I look forward to catching up with you again as soon as we can. And if you ever visit Richmond, I said this in an email to you. You and your family, the doppelgangers of my kids, we can all get together. You're welcome to stay at our place, and we'll see how that plays out. But
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on and look forward to meet you in person at some point.
absolutely. Thanks, Jimmy. Hey, thanks for listening to the show. Real quick, I just have one ask from you. I'm trying to help as many physicians as possible, and in order to do that, we have to grow the show. So please, if you found value, sign up at physiciansfirst.substack.com. Also, please share this podcast with a couple friends and colleagues who you think may gain value from it. I appreciate you listening, and let's talk again soon.